a man who spent years calling black people violent, was shot dead in the middle of a speech about black gang violence by a white man. And what Tariq Nasheed said after that? It broke the internet. Let's get into it. The nation woke to shocking news today when a polarizing public figure, a conservative commentator often accused of pushing divisive rhetoric, was fatally shot during an event in Utah. The incident unfolded on September 10, 2025, at Utah Valley State University, where the speaker had been addressing a live audience. Almost immediately, social media platforms filled with reactions. Some users expressed grief and solidarity with his supporters, while others, less sympathetic, felt no remorse over his passing. Among the latter was activist Tariq Nasheed, known for his outspoken presence on X, formerly Twitter. He had frequently clashed with the commentator online, calling out remarks he believed were harmful to the black community. The tension between the two men had been public and, at times, confrontational. That long-running feud became newly relevant once news of the shooting broke. Eyewitness accounts described the moment as chaotic and surreal. The commentator was reportedly in the middle of discussing issues related to race when the attack occurred. Even as he collapsed, microphone still in hand, the scene conveyed both the violence of the act and the intensity of the ideological battles that defined his career. The event has since sparked national debates, not just about political speech, but about the deep fractures running through American society.
Tariq Nasheed, man. Charlie Kirk goes around to campuses talking about how violent black people are. His social media timeline goes on about how violent black people are. And in the middle of a speech discussing black gang violence, Charlie gets shot by a white man.
What followed was nothing short of revealing. The silence in response to Tariq's statement spoke louder than any shouted rebuttal could have. There was no coherent counterargument, no factual correction, and no meaningful attempt to dismantle the core of what he had said. And why? Because the statement was true. Regardless of how one might personally feel about Tariq, whether one sees him as a bold truth-teller, a relentless agitator, or an opportunist who thrives on controversy, the uncomfortable reality he highlighted was undeniable. At the time of the commentator's death, this man, a polarizing figure known for incendiary remarks about race, had been speaking on the subject of black gang violence. Yet, when the fatal shot rang out, the alleged shooter was not black, but white. That fact, simple as it may have been, completely undercut the narrative that some were scrambling to push. It should have ended there, with the recognition of truth. But truth, especially when it destabilizes power structures and exposes hypocrisy, rarely sits comfortably with those invested in maintaining control. Instead of acknowledging the fact, critics and loyalists began engaging in the well-worn tactic of narrative redirection. They shifted the spotlight, reframed the debate, and moved the goalposts so far that the conversation bore little resemblance to the reality at hand. The tragedy, already painful, was now being reshaped into a political weapon, wielded against those who dared to speak honestly. This moment revealed a deeper pattern. Whenever inconvenient truths arise, especially those involving race, power, and accountability, there is a tendency among certain groups to distort the narrative rather than face it head-on. They construct straw men, attack the messenger, and create distractions so potent that the audience forgets what the original argument even was. The playbook is old, yet effective. Muddy the waters until clarity becomes impossible. In this case, the attempt to reframe the conversation only drew sharper attention to the contradiction. People could see the mismatch between the reality that a white shooter had ended the life of a man who was condemning black communities at that very moment, and the false narrative being peddled in response. As social media lit up with commentary, the divide became more visible. On one side were those insisting on sticking with the facts, amplifying Tariq's point and demanding accountability for the distortion. On the other side were those clinging desperately to a narrative that absolved them of discomfort. These voices were not engaging with the truth itself, but rather performing an elaborate dance to avoid it. They pointed fingers at Tariq, at his character, at his past statements, as though discrediting the messenger could erase the message. The strategy backfired. For many observers, the attempt to silence or sideline the truth only magnified its importance. The silence from those who might otherwise have spoken became deafening. The public could sense the unease, the avoidance, the refusal to say aloud what everyone already knew. And in that avoidance, trust began to erode. People began to ask, if they cannot admit something this straightforward, how can they be trusted on anything else? This was not merely a debate about one man's words. It was a debate about the broader relationship between truth and power. It revealed how deeply some factions rely on selective framing to preserve their authority. When facts become inconvenient, the instinct is not to confront them, but to bury them under layers of spin. Yet here, the spin was transparent, and transparency is dangerous to those who depend on illusion. In this sense, Tariq's statement functioned as a stress test for the system. Could it handle an uncomfortable reality without collapsing into denial? The answer, it seemed, was no. Instead of honest reflection, there was obfuscation. Instead of accountability, there was evasion. And in that evasion, the public witnessed something shocking: the extent to which truth is negotiable for those in power. But the story did not stop there. The more critics twisted themselves to avoid the facts, the more obvious the disparity became between what was real and what was being presented. This gap between lived reality and manufactured narrative sparked a larger conversation about the fragility of trust in institutions, media, and political movements. If loyalty to ideology could override loyalty to truth, what did that mean for the integrity of public discourse? This was the unexpected turn that left so many shocked. Not the shooting itself, though tragic. Shootings of public figures have become grimly familiar in American history, but the way the aftermath unfolded. The response revealed just how brittle the system had become. It showed that, even in the face of an undeniable fact, there are those who will twist reality until it fits their agenda. And it showed, too, how fragile the truth becomes when society allows narrative to take precedence over evidence. For many onlookers, the events became a mirror. They were forced to confront uncomfortable questions about their own biases. Would they cling to their worldview even when it was contradicted by facts? Would they participate in the collective delusion, or would they stand firm on the side of truth? The line between these choices grew clearer. And in that clarity came division. Tariq's words, once dismissed by some as inflammatory, began to echo more powerfully. They gained traction not because of who he was, but because of what he had pointed out, a reality that no amount of spin could erase. And as the conversation deepened, the moment transformed into something larger, a reckoning with how narratives are constructed, who benefits from them, and what is sacrificed in the process. The developments that followed continued to shock observers, not because they were unimaginable, but because they were so predictable. The attempts at misdirection, the silence of those who should have spoken, the outrage manufactured against the wrong target, all of it played out in real time, visible to anyone willing to look. The mask slipped, and beneath it was the unsettling truth that in the battle between power and truth, power will often try to win, even if it means erasing reality itself.
Precisely why people like Tariq Nasheed are scumbags, man. The scumbags, dude. Huh? The man literally just got shot. And you're gonna say some stupid this. You the shit, bro. Even exercise an ounce of compassion for somebody as they're going through the worst moment in their life. And you're dumb over here this type of shit, you piece of shit, dude. King piece, man. Man. I would have wished this on my worst enemy.
The way some voices responded was nothing short of contradictory. A textbook example of how avoidance often disguises itself as outrage. Rather than addressing Tariq Nasheed's arguments directly, critics reached for the low-hanging fruit of stereotype. They mocked black cultural practices, making cheap jokes about food, hairstyles, and body image, as though these shallow insults could somehow neutralize the weight of Tariq's point. It was as if by attacking the culture itself, they believed they could invalidate the truth he had presented. But the irony was glaring. None of these jabs engaged with the substance of the issue. They were distractions, plain and simple. This tactic is not new. History is full of examples where marginalized voices are met not with thoughtful debate, but with ridicule designed to reduce them to caricatures. By fixating on watermelon, fried chicken, or physical appearance, critics leaned on tropes that have been recycled for generations. These stereotypes were never meant to foster understanding. They were meant to diminish dignity, to strip individuals of their humanity, and to make audiences laugh rather than think. In this way, the conversation is derailed. The truth is buried beneath a pile of laughter and contempt. Yet the desperation in these responses was palpable. If Tariq's words had truly been baseless, if his critique had lacked substance, dismantling it would have been easy. Facts could have been countered with facts, logic with logic. Instead, what emerged was a barrage of insults aimed at black identity itself. The critics weren't just avoiding the argument, they were exposing their inability to confront it. Their fallback on stereotypes revealed that they had no intellectual ammunition left, no persuasive counterpoint that could stand on its own merit. This is the danger of relying on stereotypes. They are flimsy shields. They may create a momentary sense of superiority for those deploying them, but they crumble under even minimal scrutiny when someone points out the obvious that belittling a community's cultural habits has nothing to do with the matter at hand. The weakness of the argument becomes clear, and that weakness, in turn, highlights the power of the original statement that critics were so desperate to dodge. Moreover, the choice to target culture rather than content reveals something deeper about the critics themselves. It speaks to a fear of vulnerability. To confront Tariq's words honestly would require acknowledging uncomfortable realities about race, privilege, and the dynamics of power. That kind of reflection is dangerous for those who benefit from the status quo. It is far easier to cling to caricature than to grapple with systemic issues. Mockery becomes a coping mechanism, a way to deflect attention from truths that strike too close to home. For audiences observing this spectacle, the contradiction became clear. Here were individuals loudly claiming moral and intellectual authority. Yet when challenged, they could not summon a coherent response. Their energy was spent recycling tired insults that did little more than confirm the very criticisms being leveled against them. Instead of undermining Tariq's credibility, they ended up amplifying it. People could see the desperation for what it was, an admission, cloaked in ridicule, that the argument they wanted to suppress was too solid to dismantle. And in that moment, the insult became an unintended confession. By mocking food, culture, and identity, the critics admitted their inability to confront reality head-on. The deeper truth, the one they tried so hard to dodge, remained standing, untouched, and stronger than ever. What makes the hypocrisy clearer is the selective outrage. Certain commentators will openly ridicule Black lives, even in the most tragic circumstances, yet fall silent when the same rhetoric comes from white conservative leaders. The loyalty seems less about principle and more about proximity to power, a willingness to protect a figure like Charlie, even if it means betraying one's own community. It's a sobering reminder of how racial dynamics and privilege shape which voices are defended and which are dismissed. This divide is even more pronounced when topics like Israel and Palestine enter the conversation. Some commentators criticize Black or non-white conservatives for their positions, but when a prominent white leader expresses hardline views, those same critics stay quiet. The silence speaks volumes. Challenging white authority is off-limits, even if the values clash. It shows how political survival often requires conformity, staying in line to maintain access, status, or influence. And yet, the reality is harsh. For many individuals who throw their weight behind conservative white spaces, no matter how loudly they proclaim allegiance, no matter how faithfully they defend the ideology, the respect they crave is rarely granted in full. At first, it may seem like acceptance has been won. They may be welcomed into certain circles, invited onto podcasts, placed on panels, or given moments of visibility on television. There may be photo opportunities and the occasional spotlight, symbolic gestures that appear to signal inclusion. But beneath the surface, a different reality hums quietly. What they truly want, what many crave, even if they do not admit it openly, is not just access but validation. They long for recognition not merely as participants but as equals. Figures whose words, legacies, and sacrifices would be honored in the same breath as those of their white counterparts. And yet, when it comes to those ultimate gestures of recognition, flags lowered in mourning, public ceremonies of respect, official acknowledgments from the highest levels of power, the honor remains reserved for others. This is not to say that financial opportunities or visibility are meaningless. For some, they are enough. Having the chance to build wealth, to step into circles of influence, to benefit from association with powerful institutions, these are not trivial accomplishments, but they are transactional. They can be given and taken away depending on usefulness. One day, the non-white conservative may be the darling of the movement, showered with praise for proving the left wrong. The next day, if they falter, criticize the wrong figure, or step out of line, the very same movement may discard them with shocking ease. That is the bitter truth. Loyalty may earn you a seat at the table, but it rarely buys true equality in how your legacy is valued. Even if two individuals stand side by side, saying the same words, carrying the same message, the lens through which history sees them is often tilted. One is remembered as a pillar of the movement, immortalized in books and documentaries. The other is relegated to the margins, praised only in passing, their contributions minimized or forgotten altogether. For Black conservatives, this imbalance is doubly sharp. They operate in spaces that already frame Black identity as a problem to be solved, a pathology to be critiqued, or a culture to be reshaped. Their voices, when aligned with the dominant narrative, are celebrated for reinforcing the status quo. But when they step outside of that alignment, even slightly, they are quickly reminded that their presence was always conditional. They are valued not as independent thinkers, but as instruments to serve a purpose. Contrast this with figures like Tariq Nasheed. His approach is often polarizing. Some find him abrasive, some view him as fearless, but what sets him apart is independence. He is not bound by institutional loyalty. He does not rely on the approval of gatekeepers or the funding of political machines. Because he is not beholden to these structures, he enjoys a freedom others do not. He can speak without fear of losing invitations, sponsorships, or contracts. That freedom gives his voice a rawness that resonates with audiences hungry for unfiltered truth. Of course, independence is not without cost. To operate outside of established systems is to forego many of their protections. Independent voices often face backlash, censorship, or character assassination. They lack the safety net of wealthy backers or powerful allies. Every word they speak carries risk, because there is no shield of institutional loyalty to deflect the blow. For some, that risk is paralyzing, but for others like Tariq, the risk is precisely what gives their message power. It signals authenticity. It tells audiences, I am not saying this because I was paid to, I am saying it because it needs to be said.
Quite frankly, you guys are stupid. You guys put watermelon, you put salt on your watermelon, ridiculous. You guys eat fried chicken, ridiculous. You guys are fat as fuck, ridiculous. You guys wear weave, ridiculous. Then you have the nerve to sit there and talk to Latinas and white girls that actually do wear their hair and actually do go to the gym and exercise and say, oh, you is ugly. No, you're ugly, okay? Now here's the thing. There are some attractive black women out there, but that's a anomaly.
Meanwhile, those bound by dependence are forced into contortions. They must tread carefully, always measuring their words against the expectations of the spaces they inhabit. If a powerful white conservative leader makes a statement that clashes with their personal beliefs, they must bite their tongue or twist themselves into knots to defend it. If a member of their own community challenges those power structures, they may feel compelled to publicly denounce them. Not out of conviction, but out of necessity. Their survival in that ecosystem depends on demonstrating loyalty van at the cost of authenticity. This dynamic explains why their critiques often appear selective. They may rail against individuals within their own racial or cultural group with great passion, but when it comes to confronting white counterparts who hold power, the tone shifts. There is hesitation, deference, or complete silence. The line is clear. You may criticize laterally or downward, but never upward. The higher one climbs in proximity to power, the narrower the path becomes. Step too far outside, and the fall is swift. The difference between these two positions, intendance is more than personal. It shapes the way audiences perceive them. An independent voice may be controversial, even disliked, but they are often respected for their courage. A dependent voice may be praised within certain circles, but outside of those circles, their words ring hollow, echoing as little more than scripted performances. Audiences can sense when someone is speaking freely versus when they are speaking out of obligation, and that sense, once sharpened, cannot be dulled. Over time, the consequences of these positions become clear. The independent thinker builds a legacy of authenticity, whether celebrated or contested. Their influence may rise and fall, but it endures, rooted in the knowledge that they spoke on their own terms. The dependent thinker, by contrast, often finds their legacy tethered to those they served. When the powerful figures they aligned with fade or are discredited, so too does their own credibility. Their words are remembered less as truths and more as echoes of someone else's agenda. And so, the lesson becomes unavoidable. Freedom carries risk, but dependence carries limitation. The respect that comes from standing tall, even alone, will always outweigh the conditional acceptance offered by those who value loyalty more than truth. To seek validation from those who see you as expendable is to chase a mirage. To walk independently, though harder, is to leave behind something real. This is why Tariq's critiques resonate, even when they sting. People recognize independence when they see it. They recognize when a voice refuses to bend to power, when someone speaks despite the risks. And while not everyone agrees with his conclusions, many respect the courage it takes to stand without a safety net. It is a stark contrast to those who bend, bow, and contort themselves for acceptance, only to find that true respect is always withheld. In the end, this tension between loyalty to power and loyalty to truth defines much of the current cultural and political landscape. Some will continue to seek favor in spaces that will never fully honor them. Others will choose the harder path of independence, carrying the burden of risk but also the reward of authenticity. And for audiences watching this unfold, the question remains, which path deserves their respect, their trust, and their time?